Story number 1. The package was a lady inside. Marcus Webb lost a package inside his own van. Not misplaced behind a taller box, not slid under the seat during a hard break, gone. The parcel had been right there in the load area, 22 pounds according to his scanner, addressed to a Carol Ashworth at 14 Briar Hollow Road in Licking County, Ohio. He had scanned it at the warehouse that morning. He had physically moved 3 other packages to pull it forward, had set it near the rear doors so the delivery would be clean and fast. He had driven 11 minutes to Briar Hollow Road, stepped out of the truck, walked 40 feet to the front door, pressed the doorbell, heard it ring inside, waited, gotten no answer, walked back to retrieve the parcel, and it was not there. He checked under things. He checked behind things. He walked around the side of the truck twice. He stood in the middle of a dead-end suburban street in late November and looked up and down it and felt the gray light of the afternoon sitting on everything like a wet cloth. The kind of November gray that isn't threatening, just exhausted. The houses on Briar Hollow Road were the kind that get built in clusters on cheap land and sold before the landscaping has time to establish itself. Each one a slight variation of the same beige and taupe template. Each one set back from the road behind a rectangle of lawn that had gone the color of old straw. He could hear a dog somewhere on the next street. He could hear the ambient hum of the county route beyond the tree line. There was no reasonable explanation for where the parcel had gone. He checked his scanner. The package had been logged as out for delivery. He had 40 seconds of accountability gap between the scan and its disappearance. 40 seconds in which he had been standing at Carol Ashworth's door, waiting, and the package had simply ceased to be in his truck. He went back to the door. He noticed the windows on his second approach. Every single one of them, the 2 flanking the front entrance and the 2 on the left side of the house and what he could see of the ones on the right, was covered from the inside. Not with curtains or blinds, with brown paper. The same craft brown as the outside of a parcel, taped flat against the glass from the interior side, and in the gray afternoon light, the effect was that the house had no eyes. It was just a face of beige siding with dark spots where the window should have been, watching him come up the walk. He did not like the way that felt. He rang the bell anyway. The woman who answered could have been anywhere from 55 to 75. There is a particular kind of older woman who simply steps off the visible aging timeline at some point and lives there indefinitely, and Carol Ashworth was one of them. White hair, cropped clothes, a face that had been pretty once and was now composed, settled, patient in the way that stone is patient. Her eyes were pale gray, almost the exact color of the afternoon behind him. She was wearing a house dress with a faded print of blue flowers. She held the door half open, and Marcus could see nothing of the interior except the first few feet, a coat rack, a small console table with a ceramic bowl for keys, beige walls continuing the theme of the exterior, a hallway runner in a muted burgundy. He could smell something. Soup, he would later decide. Onions, beef broth, something with bay leaves, something warm and completely ordinary. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said, "I have a delivery for you, but I'm having some trouble locating the package." "I'm going to need to, I know," she said. Her voice was calm and level, entirely without surprise. "It's already inside. You'll need to come in and get it." The reasonable explanations lined themselves up in his head. She'd come around the back while he was at the truck. She had a second entrance. She had seen the package sitting unattended and taken it inside herself, which was unusual behavior, but not impossible. Not in a neighborhood with package theft. He was cold and he had a schedule, and she was offering him a resolution to his problem. He repeated his company's policy about not entering private residences. She said it would only take a minute. She stepped back from the door. He stepped inside. The door closed behind him. He didn't hear it close, and he didn't feel the air pressure change. But when he turned, it was shut, and Carol Ashworth was already moving down the hall ahead of him, house dress, brushing her calves, not hurrying, not checking to see if he was following. "Just this way," she said. He followed because the package was his professional responsibility, and because the exit was right behind him at all times, and because he was 29 years old and she was somebody's grandmother in a house dress who had made soup. The hallway was 5 or 6 feet wide, the walls hung with framed photographs, the standard biographical arrangement. children at various ages, holidays, somewhere warm with palm trees. He glanced at them as he walked and noticed that none of the faces were quite in focus. Not blurred from poor photography, just not quite right when he tried to look directly at them. The way certain colors slip away from the center of the eye when you try to catch them. She stopped at the doorway at the end of the hall and moved aside to let him through. He stepped through, and the room on the other side was not the room that should have been there. It took him a full 4 or 5 seconds to understand what his eyes were sending him. His brain kept running the correction algorithm, kept trying to resolve what he was seeing into something that fit inside a ranch house on a standard residential lot. A 1,200 square foot house on Briar Hollow Road could contain a living room of maybe 200 square feet, 300 if the builder had been generous. What Marcus Webb stepped into was not 200 square feet. It was not 300 square feet. It was not a room that should have been inside that house at all. The ceiling was perhaps 25 feet above him. The floor was bare hardwood, and it stretched in every direction far beyond what the exterior had any right to contain, and the space was filled, not cluttered, not packed, but filled with precise and deliberate intention, with boxes. Cardboard boxes of every size from cubic foot to the size of refrigerators, each one sealed, each one sitting alone on the floor with about 4 feet of clearance around it, as though they were in a gallery and the space between them was an aesthetic choice. They went on and on into the distance, toward walls that seemed farther away than they should have been, and there was a light source that he could not locate. No light fixtures, no windows, no lamps, but a soft and even illumination that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, like the inside of an overcast sky. Every box was addressed in neat block handwriting. He could see that from where he was standing. He didn't go to them. He didn't want to read the labels. "Here it is," Carol Ashworth said. She was standing near the center of the room, perhaps 30 feet from where he stood, and at her feet was the Ashworth parcel. His package, his specific 22-pound box with the scan label he had affixed himself that morning at the warehouse, sitting on the hardwood as though it had always been there. He had not seen her carry it. He had watched her walk down the hall in front of him, and she had not been carrying anything. He crossed the room and picked up the package. The floor was solid. His footsteps made the sounds that footsteps make. Everything was completely real, and the room was the size of an aircraft hangar and was full of boxes addressed to people who were not Carol Ashworth. "How did it get in here?" he asked. "Things come to me," she said. She wasn't being evasive or dramatic. She said it the way you say something that is simply factually true and therefore requires no elaboration. He turned toward the hallway door. The wall behind him was unbroken. He turned fully around in a slow circle, taking in all 4 walls, and there was no door in any of them. There was no way into or out of the room. There were walls and boxes and Carol Ashworth and the sourceless light and the hardwood floor, and the door he had walked through 30 seconds ago did not appear to exist. He breathed. He set the package down. He pressed both palms flat against the nearest wall, and it was solid drywall over studs, and it did not yield, and there was nothing behind it but more house, and the November afternoon and the world he had parked his truck in. "Mrs. Ashworth," he kept his voice very even, "I need to find the door." "The door goes one way," she said. "That's the nature of the door. Most things go one way." He walked the perimeter of the room. It took longer than it should have. He kept his right hand on the wall and walked, and the wall continued, uninterrupted, past box after box, and he counted the boxes as he walked, because counting was something concrete to do, because the act of counting meant he was still a person with a linear relationship to time and space, and he was at 19 boxes when he noticed the label on the 20th. His name was on it, Marcus Webb, his address in Columbus, his apartment number. He stood in front of it for a long time. He told himself he would not pick it up. He picked it up. It was the size of a shoebox, and it weighed perhaps 2 pounds, and there was no postage on it and no return address. Only his name in that same block handwriting. It felt familiar in his hands in a way that had nothing to do with having touched it before. It felt like something that had always been in his possession that he had simply forgotten about. The temperature dropped without warning. Instantaneous, total, as though the room had skipped past autumn and winter straight into something deeper than either. The comfortable soup smell was gone, and in its place was something that he would spend 2 weeks trying to identify before arriving at wet concrete, a flooded crawl space. Cold water in the dark. Carol Ashworth, who had been 30 feet away, was standing directly beside him, so close that the sleeve of her house dress brushed his forearm. She put her hand on his wrist, not grabbing, just the lightest contact, the way you touch someone's arm to get their attention, and she said, very quietly, "Don't open that until you're home." He looked up from the box in his hands, and she was at the door that now existed in the wall to his left, open, the hallway runner visible through it, the ceramic bowl on the console table at the far end, the front door beyond that standing open to the gray November afternoon and the concrete path and his truck and the county route and everything that was ordinary and outside. He walked out. He walked the way a person walks who understands that how they move through a space might matter in ways they cannot quantify, steadily, without looking back, without hurrying, telling himself with every step that he was fine and this was explicable, and he had the package under his arm and the small box in his hand, and the exit was right there and he was fine. He walked down the path and got into the truck and sat in the driver's seat for 4 minutes by the dashboard clock. 4 minutes in which he watched the front door of the house, which was now closed, and the covered windows and the November afternoon making its slow gray exit. He had 11 more deliveries. He made all of them. The small box with his name on it sat on his passenger seat for the rest of the route, and he did not touch it and did not look at it except at red lights when he looked at it anyway without wanting. 2. He stood over the trash can in his apartment parking lot that night and held it over the opening and didn't drop it and carried it upstairs and put it on the kitchen table and made dinner and ate in front of the television and didn't touch it and brushed his teeth and went to bed at 10:30 and lay there. He was awake at 2 in the morning when the silence became heavier than silence, and he got up and went to the kitchen and sat at the table and opened the box. Inside was a Polaroid photograph. His bedroom. Not a bedroom like his bedroom. His bedroom. The specific dresser with the cracked handle on the second drawer that he'd been meaning to fix for 8 months. The laundry basket with the red plastic handles. The window where the streetlight outside always came through the left side of the curtain at a particular angle when there was no wind. The photograph was taken from the corner of the room nearest the closet, angled toward the bed, and the bed was occupied. And the figure in the bed was on its back with its arms at its sides and its eyes open, and it was him. The timestamp printed in the white border at the bottom of the Polaroid said the date, which was today, and the time, which was 2:17 a.m. He checked his phone. It was 2:19. He stood in his kitchen for a very long time. Then he walked down the short hall to his bedroom doorway and stood there and looked at his bed and the depression in the mattress where he'd been lying and the pillow with his headprint still in it, and the exact angle of the streetlight through the curtain. He looked at the corner nearest the closet. He has never opened the closet since. There is a padlock on it now, a heavy one, the kind with a shackle rated for outdoor use. He told me it was already on the closet when he moved back in after staying at his brother's place for 6 weeks after November of 2019. He told me that, with a straight face before catching himself and correcting the timeline, and the correction made something shift behind his eyes in a way that I didn't ask about. He still has the Polaroid. He keeps it face down in the back of his sock drawer. Every few months he takes it out and looks at it. He says the eyes in the photograph are never quite the same. Sometimes they look open, sometimes closed, sometimes something in between that he can't accurately describe. Some intermediate state that eyes don't actually have access to. I asked him if he was sure it was always the same photograph. He put it back face down and said, "I stopped being sure of that about 2 years ago." Story. Number 2. She. 20 Mother's name. The smell hit Devon Castillo before the door was halfway open. Chanel number 5 and gardenia. Not a similar combination. Not something that evoked it. The exact specific overlap of those two scents. The way that particular cologne sits on top of a gardenia candle with its heavy floral base. The smell that had lived in his childhood home every Sunday morning for the first 19 years of his life and in no other place before or since. His mother had worn Chanel number 5 to church every week from the time he was an infant. She had kept a gardenia candle burning in the living room from October through April. She had been dead for 14 months. Devin was 24 years old, working DoorDash to cover his rent in Metairie, Louisiana, while he finished his associate's degree. It was a Tuesday night in February, 9:43 p.m., which he knew precisely because he had checked his phone when the order came in. Because the February night was cold by New Orleans standards, 41 degrees with a damp wind off the lake, and he was hoping to make one more run after this one and call it done. The address was on Cleary Avenue, a residential street of mid-century ranch homes with carports and chain-link fences and mature live oaks that buckled the sidewalk with their roots. He had delivered on Cleary Avenue before. He had delivered to this specific block before. Nothing about it had ever troubled him. He parked and gathered the order. A bag from a Vietnamese place on Veterans Boulevard, 2 containers of pho and a spring roll, the kind of order that filled his car with the smell of star anise and fish stock for an hour after the delivery, and walked up the carport toward the front door. He knocked. He heard movement inside, slow and deliberate, the movement of someone who was not in a hurry. The door opened and the smell arrived, and Devin Castillo stood very still on someone's front step in Metairie, Louisiana at 9:43 in the evening and felt his throat close. The woman who opened the door was old, somewhere in her late 70s, small, with deep brown skin and her white hair pulled back with a clip and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She was wearing a housecoat, a proper one, quilted, with big pockets, and holding the screen door open with one thin arm. She looked at Devin with an expression that was not quite recognition and not quite expectation. Something hovering between the two, a look that somehow contained both the past and the present at once. "I have your order, ma'am," Devin said. His voice came out thinner than he intended, with more air in it. "I know you do, baby," the woman said. "Come inside so I can get you your tip. It's cold out there and I don't keep my wallet by the door." She was already turning back into the house. This happens. People invite drivers in to get their tip, especially older customers who keep their money in a purse or a wallet in another room. It happens more often than people think, and more often in neighborhoods like this one, in houses owned by people of a certain age who grew up with a different understanding of thresholds and hospitality. Devin had been inside people's houses before. He had waited in entryways while retired ladies found their pocketbooks and counted out bills with careful hands. He stepped inside. The living room was directly off the entry. It was a small room, furnished with the specific density of a home that has accumulated things over many decades: a couch in a floral pattern, a coffee table stacked with magazines, a television, a bookshelf packed 2 layers deep, photographs covering every available wall surface. In the corner, on the end table beside the armchair, was a gardenia candle in a glass jar, burning. It had been burning for some time. He could tell by the way the wax had pooled. On the same table, uncapped, was a bottle of Chanel No. 5. "Sit down," the woman called from somewhere deeper in the house. "I'll be just a moment." Devin sat on the edge of the couch and held the food bag on his lap and looked at the photographs on the walls. Most of them were too far away to make out clearly. One was directly across from him at eye level, in a simple black frame, and it was a photograph of a woman in a church dress smiling at the camera. And it took him several seconds to understand why the photograph made him feel the way it made him feel. And when he understood it, he stood up from the couch. The woman in the photograph was his mother. Not someone who looked like his mother. His mother. The same face he'd looked at for 19 years and cried over for 14 months, in a dress he didn't recognize at a location he didn't recognize, but with her specific smile and her specific eyes and the particular way she held her chin slightly raised when she knew she was being photographed because she thought it was more flattering. The old woman came back into the room with a wallet, and Devin was on his feet and pointing at the photograph before he had decided to do either of those things. "Who is that?" he said. The woman looked at the photograph and then at Devin with that same expression, the one between recognition and expectation. "A friend," she said. "A dear friend. You look like her." "She's my mother," Devin said. Her name was Celestine Castillo. How do you have a photograph of my mother?" The woman sat in the armchair beside the candle and the Chanel bottle with a slowness that was not weakness but deliberateness, the movement of someone choosing to be seated rather than someone lowering themselves. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at Devon steadily. "I know her name," the woman said. "I know your name too, Devon. Sit down, please." He didn't sit. He stood in the middle of the room with the food bag in one hand and his phone in the other, and looked at the woman and at the photograph of his mother and at the candle and the perfume bottle and the room that smelled like every Sunday morning of his childhood. "Who are you?" he said. "Someone who loved your mother," she said. "Someone who knew her before she was your mother and after, and who knows where she is now, which is more than you can say, isn't it? You don't know where she is, Devon. That's what's keeping you up at night. Not the grief, not exactly, it's the not knowing." Devon had not told anyone that. He had not posted about it, had not said it to his father or his sisters or the counselor at school he'd seen for 3 sessions and stopped attending. It was the most interior and specific truth of his grief. The part that he could not share because sharing it felt like a betrayal of something, like admitting that the loss wasn't simply loss but was also a kind of epistemic disaster, a question he would carry for the rest of his life. His mother had been deeply religious. He was not. He did not know what he believed about where people went, and the uncertainty was a wound inside the wound. "How do you know that?" he said. His voice broke on the last word. "Sit down, baby," she said again, gently. He sat because his legs were done, because something in him had simply discharged in the face of this stranger who smelled like his mother's house and knew his name and kept his mother's photograph on her wall and had said the exact true thing about the exact true wound with a specificity that left no room for coincidence. He sat on the edge of the floral couch with the Vietnamese food on the cushion beside him, and he looked at the woman in the armchair. She told him things. He will not tell me most of them. When he describes this part of the story, his voice changes register, becomes quieter, more careful. The way people speak when they are handling something they're not sure can bear the weight of language. He says she told him things about his mother that he had not known, specific biographical details from before his mother's marriage, before his birth, years and years before. He says she told him things about himself, not his future, nothing predictive, but things about his interior life with such precision that hearing them spoken aloud by a stranger in a quilted housecoat in a house in Metairie was the closest thing to a spiritual experience he has ever had, and also the most frightening thing that has ever happened to him, because those two things turned out to be, in that room, identical. What he does tell me is that at some point he asked her how long she had known his mother, and she said for much longer than Devon had been alive, which his mother's age should have made impossible. He asked where they had met. She smiled, the first smile she had produced in the entire conversation, and said simply, "She came to the door." He tells me the order that occurred to him in which this landed, first as a non sequitur, then as a biographical detail, then as something else, the slow, terrible realization spreading outward like cold water. He had come to her door. His mother had come to her door. He looked at the walls of this room with their crowded photographs and realized, knew with a certainty that was physical, something in his chest, that he was not the first delivery driver who had been invited into this house, that his name had not been on the order by accident, that the Vietnamese food on the couch beside him was not the point. He asked her what she was. He did not ask who. That, he says, was not a conscious choice. It was just what came out. She looked at him for a long moment. Her hands were still folded in her lap. The gardenia candle threw its warm light across the right side of her face. She said, "The same as your mother, and the same as what you'll be, eventually. I'm just further along." He left. He walked out the front door into the 41-degree February night and stood by his car for several minutes before he could drive. He completed 0 more deliveries that evening. He went home and called his sister in Baton Rouge at 10:15 p.m. and talked to her for 2 hours about their mother, and his sister cried, and he almost did but didn't. And when he hung up at 12:20 a.m. and lay in the dark, what he felt was not fear exactly. He could not identify it precisely enough to name it. It was somewhere in the territory of recognition. He went back to Cleary Avenue the following afternoon. The house at the address was vacant, not recently vacated. Abandoned, the carport full of dead leaves, the windows filmed with the kind of grime that accumulates over years, a real estate lockbox on the door handle. A neighbor walking a dog told him the house had been empty for at least 3 years since the previous owner had died. He asked if the neighbor knew the owner's name. The neighbor thought for a moment. Old lady, he said, kept to herself, can't remember her name, kept candles burning in there all the time though. You could smell them from the street, some kind of flowers. Devin Castillo is finishing his degree now. He still delivers because the money is useful and because he cannot fully explain why stopping feels like giving something up. He said he has not smelled that combination of scents since. Not the Chanel and the gardenia together, not in anyone's home or anywhere else. He pauses when he says this, pauses for long enough to mean something. I keep thinking I'm about to, he says. Every time I knock on a door, I don't know. I keep thinking, this is the one. This is going to be the one that smells like her. I asked if that thought frightened him. Not the way it should, he said. He looked at the table between us for a while. That part scares me worse than anything else about it. Story number 3. The family was still at the table. Priya Anand will tell you she's a practical person. She'll lead with it. Volunteer it before you've asked anything. Establish it as a premise from which everything else in the story must be understood. She is an emergency room nurse with 9 years of experience at OHSU. She has worked codes. She has held pressure on wounds and administered medications and delivered bad news in the flat, careful language of medical professionalism. And she has done all of it without dissociating, because dissociation, she says, is the enemy of effective clinical work. She insists, a practical person. She was doing Instacart runs in the evenings and on weekends through the late fall of 2022 because her hospital had not yet settled its contract dispute and the resulting pay freeze meant she needed supplemental income. She was good at it. She was fast, organized. She kept a cooler bag in her car for cold items, and she triple-checked orders before leaving the store, and her ratings were uniformly 5 stars. She had been doing it for about 2 months when she took an order to a house in Beaverton, just west of Portland, on a Wednesday evening in late October. The order was nothing unusual, a full grocery run. Produce, proteins, dairy, pantry staples, cleaning products. 63 items, the kind of comprehensive shop that suggests a household rather than a single person. The customer had checked every substitution option as contact me, which meant the delivery required some back and forth through the app, and Priya had sent 7 messages during the shop and received responses to all of them, normal responses, preferences about brands and ripeness, and the kind of small grocery specifics that tell you the person on the other end is real and engaged. The house was on Elmwood Street in a residential section of Beaverton that Priya knew from deliveries. Quiet, well-maintained, the kind of street where houses have porch lights and welcome mats. She pulled up at 6:50 p.m., the last light of the October evening making everything amber and soft, and loaded up her arms and walked to the door. She rang the bell. She heard the bell ring inside. She heard nothing else. No footsteps, no television, no sounds of occupancy. She rang again. She sent a message through the app, at your door with your order, standard practice. She waited the standard 60 seconds. She was reaching for her phone to mark the delivery as an attempted when she heard the lock disengage and the door opened. The man who answered was middle-aged, late 40s, she estimated, with thinning dark hair and a button-down shirt that was untucked on one side. He looked tired. Not the end-of-day tired of someone who has worked a long day, but a deeper kind of tired, the specific exhaustion of the chronically unwell, something around the eyes and in the way the shoulders carry themselves. He looked at the bag she was holding, and then at her face, and something shifted in his expression. Not relief exactly, not pleasure, something more complicated and more dim. You can bring it inside, he said. Where in the kitchen? He stepped back and Priya, because she had 63 items in 4 bags, and because the man was clearly not going to help carry them, and because the kitchen was the logical destination for a grocery delivery, stepped inside. The house was clean. She registers this first because clinicians always do. Cleanliness is data. The entryway was tidy, shoes lined up near the door, a jacket hung neatly. The smell of the house was, she pauses here in her telling, always, and takes a breath. The smell was wrong. Not bad exactly. Not the smell of neglect or illness or any of the specific smells she associates from work with bodies and their failures. It was something she describes as metallic and green simultaneously, the way a garden smells after a hard frost, when the frozen plant matter is releasing its cellular content into the air, a cold biological smell. She had never smelled it before, and she has never smelled it since. The man led her down the entry hall toward the kitchen, and as they passed the archway to the dining room, she looked in because that's what people do. She stopped walking. The dining room table was set for dinner. 4 place settings, full service, plates, glasses, cutlery, cloth napkins folded into triangles, a candle in the center, half burned, a serving dish with a lid, and a water pitcher and a bread basket with rolls. Everything arranged with the careful intention of a family dinner, a real dinner, the kind with effort behind it. The family was seated at the table. A woman, the wife, Priya assumed, sat at the far end, and 2 children, a boy and a girl who appeared to be perhaps 8 and 11, sat on the sides. They were all seated upright, napkins in laps, hands visible on the table. They were all looking at Priya, not looking up at her arrival the way people look up when someone walks past, looking at her directly and without the social modulation that people apply to staring, the way that very young children sometimes stare at strangers before they've learned that prolonged eye contact is a loaded act. None of them had touched their food. Priya looked at the woman at the end of the table, and the woman looked back at her, and Priya said, because she needed to say something, and something medical and concrete was the only language she had access to, "Are you all right?" The woman smiled. The smile was technically a smile in its components, the upward curve of the mouth, the display of teeth, but it didn't reach the rest of her face, which remained as still and uninflected as the rest of her. "We're fine," she said. "We're just waiting." "Waiting for what?" Priya said. "For it to be done," the woman said, and looked at the serving dish in the center of the table. The man who had answered the door was now standing beside Priya, and she became aware of him there the way you become aware of things that appear without the normal signals of their arrival. She hadn't heard him move up behind her, hadn't felt the air pressure change. He was just there. "You can set the groceries in the kitchen," he said. "It's through there." She looked from him to the table, and she told herself what the nurse in her told her. This is a family having a difficult time. This is stress and exhaustion presenting as affect flatness. This is real-world human beings going through something hard, and she had no clinical standing here, and her job was to deliver 63 grocery items and leave. She told herself this in the 30 seconds it took her to walk to the kitchen and set the bags on the counter. The kitchen was on the other side of the dining room wall. The wall had a pass-through window, and through it she could see the dining table and the family seated at it. She unloaded the bags methodically. She kept moving, because movement was purposeful, and purposefulness kept the noise in her head at a manageable level. Produce in the crisper. Dairy in the fridge. She opened the refrigerator and registered what was inside without meaning to. It was full. Not full the way a refrigerator that has just been shopped is full. Full the way a refrigerator gets when nothing is being used, when food comes in and nothing is consumed. Container after container. Tupperware and glass dishes and takeout boxes, every shelf loaded. She saw 3 other Instacart bags, unopened, shoved in beside the shelves. She closed the refrigerator. She looked through the pass-through window at the family at the table. None of them had moved. The children were still looking at the doorway where she had been standing, not at her now different position, just at the doorway, as though that was where they'd fixed their attention and they were leaving it there. The woman was looking at the serving dish. The man had come back into the dining room and taken his seat at the near end of the table, across from his wife. The serving dish had a lid, and she could not see what was in it. She finished unloading with the systematic focus of someone who is declining to think about what they are thinking about. She folded the bags and set them on the counter. She typed a completion message into the app. She looked through the window one more time. The man was looking at her, directly at her through the pass-through window with the same absence of social modulation as the children had looked at her from the doorway. "You can stay," he said. She left, through the kitchen doorway into the hall, and down the hall past the dining room archway, and she did not look in as she passed it. But she heard something. The lid of the serving dish, she thought, the metallic sound of a lid being removed, and then a sound that she cannot accurately describe except to say that it was organic and it was slow and it was the sound of something that requires patience. She was outside and at her car in 20 seconds. She sat in the car and then she drove. She drove for about 4 minutes before she pulled into a parking lot of a strip mall on Canyon Road and stopped and sat in the car with the engine running and the heat on and the radio going with something she wasn't hearing, and then she called 911. She told the dispatcher she was concerned about the welfare of a family at an address on Elmwood Street. She described the affect presentation of all 4 family members. She described the full refrigerator and the unopened grocery deliveries. She described the ambient quality of the house and the sound she had heard when she was leaving. The dispatcher took the address and said they would send a wellness check. She never found out what the officer who responded found. She called back twice and was told she was not next of kin and they couldn't disclose information. She drove by the house the following morning, and it looked precisely as it had looked the previous evening. The porch light was on. The car was in the driveway. The curtains were drawn. She checked the order app. The customer had left a tip, $23, added after she'd left, and a single-line note in the rating that read, "Thank you for coming inside." She deactivated her Instacart account that week. She tells this story at the pace of a clinical briefing, measured and precise, and the precision is the most disturbing thing about it, because precision like that is what happens when a person has rehearsed an account so many times they have sanded away every excess until what remains is a shape they can carry. I asked her what she thought was in the serving dish. She said, "I think about that every day. Then, I think they were waiting for it to be ready. Whatever it was, I think it takes a long time, and I think the family had been waiting at that table for a while. Days, maybe. I think the deliveries were because they couldn't leave the table." She stopped. "I think if I'd stayed, I think it would have had me too." She looked at her hands on the table between us, a nurse's hands, practiced and steady. "What I can't explain," she said carefully, "is why part of me wanted to." Story number 4. Every door on Thornfine curtly was open. Kara Walsh took the Amazon Flex block on Sunday evening because the money was good and because she was $700 short on her rent and because her alternatives were limited. She was 26 years old, living in a studio apartment in Tempe while she looked for work in her field, and the gig had been a bridge that had lasted 8 months so far. She didn't dislike it. She liked the solitude of it, the structure, the clean transactional simplicity of picking up packages and delivering them, and the quiet of driving through the Phoenix metro at odd hours when the traffic thinned out and the desert heat came down. From 108 to something more manageable, and the city went strange and beautiful in the dark. She picked up her block at the Amazon facility on Price Road at 6 p.m. on a Sunday in August, 41 packages, a compact zone in Chandler, projected completion at 9:40. She had done this route before and she moved through it efficiently, the GPS calling addresses and her arm moving the packages from the back of her Corolla to doors in a rhythm she'd gotten good at. The last cluster was a cul-de-sac in a development called Thornfield Court, which she knew by name because she delivered there twice before. It was a planned community that had been built in the early 2000s, identical Spanish colonial homes in beige and terracotta, all with tile roofs and 2-car garages and the kind of desert landscaping that substitutes gravel and succulents for lawn. The cul-de-sac itself held 12 houses in a circle. She had 7 packages for addresses on it. At 9:03 p.m. on a Sunday in August, she pulled in. Every door was open, not standing ajar. Open, pulled back fully, interior lights spilling yellow rectangles onto the concrete stoops, and on every stoop there was a figure, not standing, seated. Every house on the circle had a person seated on its front step facing outward. And in the silence and stillness of 9 p.m. in a Chandler cul-de-sac, it took Kira several seconds to understand that this was not a neighborhood event, not a block party, not something normal she was missing the context for. There were no sounds of conversation, no drinks, no folding chairs, no citronella candles, just people sitting on front steps with their doors open behind them, facing the center of the cul-de-sac, as though they were an audience and the center of the circle was the stage. She drove in slowly because she was delivering to these addresses and the GPS was directing her and her brain was still negotiating. She parked near the center of the cul-de-sac, where the curved street widened, and she looked at the nearest house, which was number 42. The person on the step of 42 was a woman, perhaps 40, in a sundress. She was sitting with her hands in her lap and her face turned toward the center of the circle. Her expression, Kira could see it in the spill of the interior light, was not blank, it was anticipatory. It was the expression of an audience member who has arrived early for something they've been looking forward to for a very long time. Kiera sat in her car for about 30 seconds and then she picked up the package for 42. Because she was here and it was her job and she needed the money and she was going to try to be normal. She walked to the step. The woman on the step did not look at her as she approached. She did not react at all. Kirea said, "Delivery for number 42," and the woman's head turned toward her, slowly, with a mechanical quality that made the short hairs on Kira's neck stand straight. "Please come inside and sign," the woman said. She had a pleasant, level voice, the kind of voice used in guided meditations or corporate hold music. "We need a signature for this one." Amazon Flex does not require signatures for residential packages. It had never required a signature in 8 months and 40-odd deliveries. This was not a thing that was happening. "I actually don't need a signature for this delivery," Kira said, setting the package on the step beside the woman. "We need a signature," the woman said again. She had turned her face back to the center of the cul-de-sac. Kira looked at the house behind the woman. The open door and the interior light and a foyer she could see. Tiled floor, a console table, a hallway leading back. She could see, at the far end of the hallway, other people. Seated, more of them, in the hall and in the room beyond, arranged in the same facing outward configuration as the people on the stoops, as though everyone inside was also directing their attention toward the open door in the circle in the center. She looked around the cul-de-sac, all 12 houses, all open, all occupied on the stoops, all lit from inside. She counted 27 people visible from where she stood, 27 people sitting in silence on this Sunday night, arranged around a center point, waiting. She said, "What are you all waiting for?" The woman on the step turned her face toward Kira and her expression changed. It changed completely, and the change was wrong because it happened too fast. Not the gradual shift of a human expression, but an instantaneous replacement, as though one face had been swapped for another. What replaced the anticipatory calm was something Kira describes as recognition, not of Kira, of something that Kira represented, some category or role that clicked into place for this woman when the question was asked. Recognition and a relief so intense it was almost painful. "You're here," the woman said. "Just that. You're here. 2 doors away, on the step of 44. The man sitting there turned his head at exactly the same moment as the woman finished speaking and looked directly at Kira, and then the people on the steps of 46 and 48 turned their heads simultaneously as well, and the synchronicity of it, the coordinated nature of it, the way all those heads moved in the same beat, made something occur to Kira that she cannot fully articulate, but describes as the understanding that this had been arranged for her specifically, that the 7 packages addressed to Thornfield Court had not been in her block by coincidence, and that whatever they were waiting for in the center of this cul-de-sac, she was it. She got back in her car. She put it in drive and she kept her eyes on the GPS, which was still calmly indicating that she had 6 remaining deliveries on Thornfield Court. She drove toward the exit of the cul-de-sac, not fast, not slow, and every head on every stoop turned as she passed, tracking her car in silence. 27 faces following her exit with that same expression of recognition and something darker underneath it, something that was not quite disappointment because disappointment implies impermanence. She left the remaining 6 packages in her car. She drove off the block. She marked the remaining packages as delivery attempted and sent them back to the facility and took the completion penalty and did not care. She sat in a Walgreens parking lot on Alma School Road for about 20 minutes, and then she drove home, and she sat in her studio apartment with the lights on and spent the next 2 hours on her laptop trying to find anything about Thornfield Court, news stories, neighborhood forums, next-door posts, anything. She found one thing. A next-door thread from 8 months prior in a neighboring development, titled, "Anyone else notice the gathering on Thornfield Court?" The original post asked if anyone knew what the event was, described people seated outside on a Sunday night, doors open. The post had one comment, from an account that had since been deleted, which read, "Don't go in. If they ask you in, don't go in. I went in March." The commenter had not written anything else. Their account had been created and deleted within the same week. There was no other information about who they were or what had happened in March. Kiera transferred out of the Chandler zone the following week. She has never driven on Thornfield Court again. She told me that for about 6 months afterward, she found herself in a state of fixed and abstract vigilance whenever she pulled into a cul-de-sac, scanning the stoops, counting the doors. "I kept thinking I was going to find it again," she said, "that wherever I was driving, I was going to turn into one of these little circles and they'd all be there." I asked her if she ever figured out what they were waiting for. "No," she said, "but I keep thinking about the woman and how she said you're here. Like I was very specifically the right person. Not just a person, me." She picked at the edge of her coffee cup. "That's the part I can't set down. Because I've delivered thousands of packages, and I've wondered every time since which ones I was meant to bring." Story number 5. The thing in the back room was dual warm earing my face. Nathan Briggs will tell you up front that he has a practical theory and a real theory, and that the practical theory is that what he saw in the back room of a brownstone on Ellery Street in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in April of 2021 was a specific kind of dissociative episode triggered by the psychological stress of the pandemic year, a perceptual distortion generated by his own brain and experience as external, and that this is probably what actually happened. He will tell you this first, clearly and without shame, as a man who has been to therapy and made peace with uncertainty. Then he'll tell you the real theory, which is that none of that explains the photograph. Nathan was 33, a UPS driver covering a dense Cambridge-Somerville route. 4 years in, familiar with the neighborhoods and their specific character, the students, the professors, the tech workers, the longtime residents who had owned their buildings since before the area gentrified and now watched their property values with the satisfaction of survivors. He liked the route. He liked the old architecture, the brownstones and triple-deckers and bow-front buildings, the way history was physically present on every block. He had, he would tell you, been perfectly mentally healthy in every way that he was capable of assessing. He had been sleeping well, eating normally, calling his parents on Sundays. The pandemic had been hard on him the way it had been hard on everyone, no worse. The brownstone on Ellery Street was a two-family. He had a package for the second-floor unit, which had a resident named E. Marchetti, first name obscured by a middle initial in his system, a single name, no apartment buzzer response when he pressed it. He pressed the building's buzzer and the front door opened without a voice coming through the intercom, which is something buildings do, a shorthand. He went up the stairs to the second floor and knocked on the door of Unit 2 and waited. He had knocked on 700,000 doors. He knows how a door sounds when someone is behind it approaching it. He knows the particular density of silence that means a unit is unoccupied, and the slight different quality of silence that means a unit is occupied and still. Unit 2 had the second kind of silence. Someone was home and not moving, and then the door opened. The person who opened it was a man, roughly Nathan's age, Nathan's height, Nathan's build, with dark hair and a week of stubble and tired eyes and a gray t-shirt with a small bleach stain on the left shoulder. Nathan noticed the bleach stain because he had a gray t-shirt with a bleach stain in almost that exact location from when he'd cleaned his bathroom in February and dripped bleach from a sponge. The coincidence registered and then slid away, the way coincidences do. The man, E. Marchetti, looked at the package Nathan was holding and then at Nathan's face, and his expression was strange in a way Nathan registered without being able to immediately name. He looked at Nathan the way you look at someone in a photograph, with recognition but also with a distance that photographs put between the viewer and the subject, as though Nathan were an image of a person rather than a person. "Could you bring it inside?" he said. "I'm waiting on something in the back. Just set it by the door." The unit was a standard Cambridge second floor, high ceilings, wood floors. The slight impracticality of old buildings made livable by the dignity of their bones. Books on shelves. A kitchen visible through a doorway, coffee maker on the counter with a half-full pot. A jacket on a hook that was the same make and color as the one Nathan was wearing under his UPS vest. He set the box down by the door and straightened up. The door to the back room was open. Not all the way, open about 40 degrees. A slice of the room visible past it, warm lamplight and a bookshelf and a section of window with afternoon light behind the curtain. And in the slice of room visible through the gap, sitting in a chair by the window, was a person. Nathan looked at the slice of room and his brain did the thing that Marcus Webb's brain had done in a house in Licking County. The correction algorithm, the processing loop, the attempt to impose a familiar interpretation on something that was resisting it, because the person in the back room, sitting in the chair in the lamplight with one knee crossed over the other and one hand resting on the knee and the face turned toward the window, was him, not someone who resembled him. Not a brother or a cousin in the way that related people resemble each other, not a trick of light or the distortion of a partial view through a 40-degree gap in a door. It was his face, his posture, his specific body in his specific clothes, sitting in a chair in a room it had no reason to be in an apartment belonging to a stranger, and the figure was not moving. He said, and he says this was not a decision, the words came out without consultation. "Who is that?" Marchetti looked at him, and then at the door to the back room, and his expression shifted into something tired and something like apology. "It's been there for a while," he said, "since I moved in. I've gotten used to it." "What is it?" "I don't know. I think it's connected to whoever the apartment was meant for. The person who should have lived here before me." He paused. "Or the person who was going to live here after." Nathan looked at the figure in the back room. The figure had not moved. It was sitting in the chair at exactly the angle and posture he would naturally sit in while looking out a window. The position his body defaulted to when he wasn't thinking about it. And it was wearing clothes he owned, not identical clothes. His clothes, recognizably and specifically, with the specific fading at the knees of the jeans and the specific way the shirt sat. He could not see its face, but he knew the face that was there. "Why did you ask me to come inside?" Nathan said. "Because it does this," Marchetti said. "Every time a delivery comes, it moves toward the door when someone knocks. And I wanted to see what it did when the person actually came in." His voice had the careful neutrality of someone reporting an observation, a scientist or an investigator, someone trained to be precise. "It hasn't moved," he said. "Since you came in, it usually moves toward the door. You came in and it just..." He gestured at the back room. Stopped. Nathan looked at the figure, and the figure was still. He picked up his package and walked to the front door and opened it and went down the stairs and out of the building. On the front steps he stopped and stood in the Cambridge afternoon, the April air with its specific cold and the brownstone blocks and the sound of a truck on Mass Ave, and he stood there for what he thinks was about 4 minutes. He went back up the stairs. He knocked on Unit 2 again. Marchetti opened it. "Was there a photograph?" Nathan said. "In the apartment when you moved in? Specifically a photo, by itself, not part of any of the tenants' things?" Marchetti looked at him. "How do you know about a photograph?" Nathan told me he does not know how he knew. He did not know until Marchetti said it that there was a photograph, and then the moment it was confirmed he understood that he had known from the moment he'd seen the figure in the chair, had known without source or reason. "Where is it?" he said. Marchetti went to the bookshelf and came back with a photograph in a plain frame, a printed photograph, standard print size, slightly too dark. It was a photograph of Nathan's apartment building, his specific building in Somerville, a 3-decker on Cherry Street, taken from the street, in daylight, the angle of a person standing on the sidewalk looking at the building. His unit's window visible on the 2nd floor with the curtain he'd hung when he moved in 3 years ago. A photograph of his building in his apartment 3 miles away in the hands of a stranger who had never been there. He has it now. It lives in a locked box under his bed, along with some other things from his life that he prefers to keep close and monitored. He has been back past the building on Ellery Street several times since, the way people return to sites of things. He has not gone inside again. He has looked up at the second-floor windows each time, the ones that would correspond to Unit 2, and each time the window has had a figure visible in it, sitting still, facing out. His new route does not include Cambridge. He requested the change in the fall of 2021. His supervisor asked no questions, which Nathan has decided to accept as the universe being, on this one occasion, minimally kind. "I don't let myself think about it during the day," he told me. "I'm pretty good at that. Not thinking about things during the day." He looked out the window of the coffee shop where we met, at the street and the brick buildings and the perfectly ordinary afternoon. "It's at night," he said. "At night I think about what Marchetti said, that it moved toward the door when someone knocked and then stopped when I came in." He didn't say anything for a while. "I think about what it was waiting for. I think about whether it got it." A long pause. "I think about whether it's still sitting in that chair or whether it's doing something else now." Story number 6. The children mic'd me with their mouths closed. Alejandro Cruz had been driving for FedEx for 3 years when he pulled up to a property on County Road 16, outside Ranger, Texas, in Eastland County. On a Thursday morning in July of 2019, he had been doing the rural route for 11 months. He knew this part of the drive. The long, flat stretches of northwest Texas where the sky takes up 70% of the visual field, and the land under it is cedar and mesquite and the occasional pump jack nodding in the heat. The ranch gates and the long, unpaved driveways that are standard on rural routes and which he had learned to navigate with patience. The property on CR 16 was not a working ranch. It was a residence, a 2-story frame house set well back from the road on a dirt drive, surrounded by the dry grass and cedar of a property that had once been maintained and was no longer quite keeping up with itself. There was a tire swing in the front yard on a live oak. There was a vegetable garden in raised beds to the right of the house, tended with tomato cages and a soaker hose. And this contrast, the slight neglect of the house and grounds against the careful attention of the garden, was something Alejandro noticed but did not assign significance to. People prioritize different things. He parked at the end of the drive and walked the package to the door. The door was wood, painted red once, now faded to the color of dried blood. He knocked. He heard movement inside, plural movement, the shuffle of more than one person. The door opened. A boy of about 9 or 10 answered the door. Dark hair, dark eyes, a striped shirt, jeans with a dirt stain on one knee. Normal. A normal kid in a normal house in rural Texas, squinting slightly against the morning sun. "I have a package for this address," Alejandro said, holding out the scanner. "My mom needs you to bring it inside," the boy said. "I can leave it here at the door," Alejandro said. "She says she needs you to sign something," the boy said. "She's in the kitchen." Alejandro looked past the boy into the house. He could see the living room, a couch, a television, a braided rug, normal. He could hear something from the kitchen, what he identified as a radio or television program, a voice speaking. He could see through the living room to the kitchen doorway, where a woman was visible, standing with her back to him at the kitchen counter. Just a woman in a kitchen. He had children of his own. He had a daughter who was 7, and a son who was 11. And he had spent considerable parental energy teaching both of them never to open the door to a stranger alone. And this boy had opened the door alone, which made him feel the particular sympathy of a parent for a child whose parents have maybe not gotten around to that conversation yet. He went inside. There were more children. The living room had appeared empty from the doorway. It was not empty. There were 3 more children in it. A girl of perhaps 12 on the couch, another girl who looked about 7 on the floor near the television, and a second boy, younger than the one who had answered the door, maybe 6, in the armchair. All of them were looking at him. All of them had the same expression the door boy had, the same direct and unmodulated looking at him, and all of them were very still. He could not hear a radio or television from the kitchen anymore. The woman came out of the kitchen and into the living room doorway. She was perhaps 35, thin, with dark hair pulled back and the look of someone who has been working hard for a long time and is running on whatever comes after tiredness. She was wearing a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow and jeans and no shoes. She looked at Alejandro and then at the package he was carrying, and something in her face arranged itself into something that was not quite relief and not quite desperation, a combination the two had, made when they got tired of existing separately. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for coming inside." "You had a package," Alejandro said. She looked at the package in his hands as though she had forgotten it was the reason he was there. "Yes," she said. "Yes. Could you set it on the table?" He crossed the living room to the dining table and set the package down, and the children did not move, but their eyes did, tracking him as he moved across the room, all four of them in the same sustained direct attention. And the thing he noticed, standing in the living room of this house with the four children watching him, was that none of them made noise. Not fidgeting noise, not the ambient small sounds that children produce, the scraping of feet on floor, the slight vocalizations, the movement of air in and out of living bodies. They were absolutely silent, and they were not blinking. He looked at the younger girl, the 7-year-old on the floor closest to him, and watched her eyes, and she did not blink for the full 30 seconds that he was aware of watching her, and the open stillness of those eyes on him made a cold pressure move through his abdomen. "Are they all right?" he said. He said it to the woman, quietly, as you say something you don't want the children to hear. "They're fine," the woman said. We're going through a thing. All of us." "What kind of thing?" She looked at him for a long moment. She was leaning against the kitchen doorframe, and in the light from the kitchen behind her she looked very tired and also, he thought, very grateful that he was still here and had asked the question, the way that someone drowning looks at a person on shore who has noticed them. She said, "It started with the water." She said this and then seemed to catch herself, to retreat behind the careful affect of someone managing what they allow out. "It doesn't matter," she said. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't. It's nothing." "The water," Alejandro said. She looked at her children. The boy who had answered the door was still in the entry, standing exactly where he had been. The girl on the couch had not moved. The girl on the floor was still watching Alejandro with her open, unblinking eyes. The small boy in the armchair was the only one not looking at Alejandro. He was looking at the window, at the rectangle of July Texas morning outside it, looking at the open air the way a caged animal looks, with a quality of attention that is not curiosity but is the absolute opposite of acceptance. "The well," she said. "Something's in the well. I don't know what. It came up in the water, or it came from the water, or maybe the water just introduced it. In February. The kids drank the well water in February, and since then they've been—" She stopped. She pressed her lips together. "They don't talk much anymore. They used to talk all the time. My youngest talked constantly from the time he woke up. He hasn't said anything since February." She looked at the small boy in the armchair watching the window. "He says something's outside," she said, "or he used to say it. Before he stopped talking, he said there was something outside that came up from the well and that it was waiting." The small boy turned from the window. He looked at his mother first and then at Alejandro, and his face was 6 years old and very calm, and he opened his mouth. He didn't speak. He opened his mouth, and the inside of his mouth was wrong. Not wrong as in injured, not wrong as in ill, wrong as in it was darker than the inside of a mouth should be. A depth that didn't match the interior anatomy, and from that depth came a sound that Alejandro describes as not a sound but a pressure, a vibration at a frequency below his ability to hear but above his ability to not feel, a pulse that moved through his chest like a second heartbeat, slower than his own, enormous in its patience. Alejandro was at the front door and through it and across the porch and down the steps before he had decided to move. He moved the way people move in nightmares, with total commitment and no sense of actually covering ground. And then he was at his truck, and he was in the truck, and he was driving down the dirt road with the property shrinking in his rearview mirror. He filed an official welfare concern with Eastland County Child Protective Services that afternoon. He was told a caseworker would follow up within 72 hours. He called back 5 days later to check. He was told the address had been visited and the children had been observed and no concerns had been identified at that time. He asked what the children had been like when the caseworker visited. There was a pause, and then the woman on the phone said they had been quiet. "He has 3 children. He's lived in Fort Worth with his wife and his 3 children for 4 years now, and he is, by his own account, happy there and grateful for it." He checks on them at night. He has mentioned to no one in his family that he occasionally, when watching them sleep, counts their blinks. He is not sure what he would do if the count came back wrong. The thing that stays, he told me, is the small boy's mouth, the depth of it, that dark, and the heartbeat feeling, the slowness of it. It was patient in a way that felt geological, like it had been patient for a long time before any of us were born and would be patient for a long time after. He thought for a moment. I kept thinking about the well, about something coming up from the water, about what was below the water table, about what had always been there, about how long it had been there, about whether the children were gone or whether they were still in there. He looked at the table. About whether there's a difference. Story number 7. 3 years of deliveries to an address that wasn't on ain't map. Simone Hargrove kept meticulous records. This is important to understand first because it is the reason she knows what she knows, and it is also the reason the knowledge is what it is. She kept a small personal log of her UPS routes, not required by her employer, entirely her own initiative, dating back to her first year on the job in 2017, because she liked the data of it, liked the tracking of efficiency and mileage and delivery times, liked the way a route could be optimized over months of careful attention. She was 35 years old in 2020, worked a suburban route in Naperville, Illinois, had been with UPS for 4 years, and her records were thorough. This is how she knows that she made deliveries to an address at 9 Clarion Way in Naperville on 47 separate occasions over the course of approximately 3 years. She knows the dates. She knows the package counts. She knows the delivery windows. She knows that on 11 of those 47 occasions, her records show a gap between the delivery scan and the next delivery scan that is larger than the physical distance between the addresses can account for. The gaps range from 31 minutes to, on one occasion in March of 2019, 2 hours and 43 minutes. She does not remember what happened during those gaps. She doesn't mean she has vague memories. She means no memories at all, cleanly absent, the way a night of sleep is absent. The route simply resumes, with her in her truck on the next street, the next package in her hand, no subjective interval between. She has asked her own doctors about this and received the full range of explanations that medicine offers for episodic memory loss, stress, sleep deprivation, dissociation, early onset conditions she prefers not to name. She has had full neurological workups. Nothing was found. She discovered the problem with the address in the spring of 2020, during the first weeks of the pandemic lockdown, when Naperville residential deliveries had tripled and she was working 10, 11, 12-hour days. She had been using her personal log to manage the surge, cross-referencing delivery times to identify inefficiencies, and she was looking at her March records when she noticed that 9 Clarion Way appeared 17 times across 3 years in her personal log, but produced 0 matches when she searched it in her company's delivery system. Not filtered out, not in a different category, 0 matches. The address had no record in her employer's system of having ever received a delivery from her or anyone else. She drove to Clarion Way on her day off. It was early April, the kind of pale, cold morning that April does in northern Illinois. Everything still bare, the yards gray-brown. She drove down the street slowly, reading the numbers on mailboxes and houses and curbs. There was no number 9. The numbers on Clarion Way ran 5, 7, 11, 13. The gap between 7 and 11 was not a vacant lot or a missing house. It was a driveway, concrete, with a mailbox post but no mailbox, and behind the driveway, a section of lawn that showed the faint and overgrown marks of foundation plantings from years ago, the kind left behind when a house is removed, not burnt or condemned, just removed. The lot between 7 and 11 was empty ground with a driveway and a mailbox post and no other evidence that a building had ever stood there, except those faint marks in the earth. Simone sat in her car and looked at the empty lot. She had a specific, physical memory of that driveway. She remembered the texture of it, the concrete with a small aggregate that gives it a slightly rough feel through the soles of boots. She remembered the slight upward grade as she walked from the street to the door. She remembered the door itself, which was dark green, wood, with a brass knocker in the shape of something she could never quite describe with precision, an animal or a face or something that resolved differently each time she tried to look directly at it. She remembered the bell and the way it rang and the person who answered it. She could not describe the person who answered it. She had been there 47 times and she could not produce a clear image of the person who had opened the dark green door. And this is the part of the story that made her, finally, sit on her bathroom floor and hold very still and understand that something was wrong. 47 times. She had delivered to this address 47 times, had been invited inside 11 of those 47 times, had lost time on those 11 occasions, and she could not describe the person who had invited her. She went to her personal log and looked at the records of the 11 occasions with time gaps. She looked at what she had written about those visits, because she made notes when deliveries had notable features, a difficult entry code, a dog, a customer request. Her notes for 9 Clarion Way on the 11 gap occasions read, across all 11 entries, some version of the same 3 words, came inside, signed. That was it every time in her own handwriting. Came inside, signed, as though those 3 words were a complete account. She went to her doctor. She went to 2 doctors. She went to a neurologist who ordered an MRI and an EEG and found nothing abnormal. She went to a psychologist who worked with her for 6 months on the gaps and produced, at the end of 6 months, the clinical assessment that she presented as a normal, highly functional, psychologically healthy individual with isolated episodes of what was likely work stress-related dissociation and that there was no underlying pathology to account for. She does not believe this assessment. She has it framed on her wall. She told me she framed it as a reminder that the absence of a clinical explanation is not the same as the absence of something to explain. In 2021, she connected with an online forum for people who had experienced anomalous lost time events, not a paranormal community, a support community, people who had had experiences that resembled hers in structure if not in context. She told her story. She received, in response, a private message from a man in Spokane who had had a similar experience, similar enough that the structural parallels were statistically implausible as coincidence. He had also made repeated visits to an address that his company's records did not contain. He had also experienced time gaps on visits that involved going inside. He had also been unable to describe the resident. His time gaps, he told her, had also been growing longer over the period of the visits. She asked if he had ever figured out what happened during the gaps. He said, "One time I got home and there was dirt under my fingernails, like I had been digging, and I hadn't been anywhere that would explain it. And I looked at my hands and I thought about the address and I thought about what could be under the ground at an address that doesn't exist, and I decided to stop asking that question." Then he said, "Do you know how many times you were asked inside?" She said, 11. There was a long pause before he responded. When he did, he said only, "I was asked inside 8 times before I noticed the gaps. I've been asking myself what would have happened if I had gone 9 times. If there's a number that completes something. If 11 already did." He went offline and did not respond to further messages. Simone Hargrove retired from UPS in 2022 after 18 years. She told me she didn't retire because of 9 Clarion Way, that the timing was coincidental, and then she said both those things with a quality that suggested she was testing how each of them sounded out loud and evaluating how convincing they were. She has not experienced any additional lost time episodes since leaving the route. She has not gone back to Clarion Way. She has not checked whether the lot is still empty or whether something has changed there. She has decided, she says, that there are certain data points she would rather leave unverified. She still keeps logs of everything. Old habit. She showed me her current calendar, the notes she keeps about her days, the careful tracking of time and activity. Every hour accounted for, every appointment recorded, every day fully and meticulously documented. "I need to know where I've been," she said. "I need to know where my time is going." She looked at the calendar for a moment. "I spent 11 sessions inside something I can't remember and I can't describe. I spent 3 years returning to an address that doesn't exist. And I keep the logs now because," she stopped, restarted, "because I need there to be a record, in case the gaps come back, in case something is tracking time differently than I am." She closed the calendar. In case what I remember is not what happened. In case something is editing. She said this last word carefully, as a person says a word they have chosen with great deliberation. Editing, she said again. The way you cut a film, the way you take out the parts that the audience isn't supposed to see. I asked her what she thought was in the parts that had been cut. She looked at the table for a long time before she answered. I think, she said slowly, that I was useful to something. For 3 years. I think I was brought inside and used for something and then returned. And I think whatever I was used for. She stopped again. The coffee in the cup in front of her had gone cold. The afternoon outside the window was doing ordinary afternoon things. Somewhere nearby a car horn sounded and somebody laughed at something, and the world continued its completely normal operation. I think it's not finished, she said. I think whatever used me is patient. I think patience is the main thing it has. She picked up the cold coffee and put it down. I think about the 11 times. I think about the man in Spokane and his 8 times. And I think about whether 11 is enough or whether it was working towards something larger. I lie awake and I add up the minutes, the gaps, all 11 of them, how long I was in there in total. I've done this calculation so many times I know it without trying. A small pause. 6 hours and 19 minutes, she said. That's how long I was inside something that doesn't exist, that I can't remember, and that is no longer where it was. She set the cup down precisely in the center of its ring on the table. 6 hours and 19 minutes that belonged to something else now. She stood up to leave. She was already buttoning her coat when she turned back and said the last thing, the thing she said she had never said out loud to anyone. Last week, she said, I found dirt under my fingernails, and I haven't been anywhere that would explain it. She left before I could respond. The coffee shop door closed behind her and I sat at the table for a while with my notes, which did not feel like they contained enough words for what they were supposed to contain. And outside, the afternoon continued to be ordinary, and I looked at my own hands on the table and the spaces under my own nails, and I thought about records and gaps and the patience of things that wait in the space between what is remembered and what actually happened. And I did not feel better for having thought about it, and I have not felt fully better since.